Welcome to the More Than English podcast, where we discuss fascinating and influential ideas, learning English along the way. Here we learn more than English.
I'm your host, Stephen. Today we're going to continue talking about this concept, this ideology of realism, but more specifically, the differences between classical realism and structural realism. So if all of this sounds a bit strange to you, I strongly recommend that you watch the first episode of this podcast where we go over the basics, the fundamental ideas of realism. And you can do that by clicking the link here. So, whereas in the first episode you were introduced to the scholar John Mearsheimer, today I'm going to introduce you to some more scholars, and hopefully by the end of the episode you will know whether you are a classical realist, structural realist, or neither. So let's get started with this second episode of the podcast. Robert Greene is another famous author that's written a lot about power in his career. In fact, he has the best-selling book, The 48 Laws of Power, which makes him quite an expert in the area. Recently he did a podcast with Andrew Huberman, and of course he talked about power there, given that he's written so much about it. But I was quite surprised to see that the similarities between him talking about power as perhaps more of a psychologist or a sociologist were so similar to some of the ideas that John Mearsheimer presented. Although John Mearsheimer is a self-proclaimed structural realist. So for him, when he talks about realism, he's talking about specifically nations, the way nations cooperate or relate to each other. Robert Greene, on the other hand, talks specifically and exclusively about individuals. He's not talking about international relations on a national level, but more about human nature. Robert Greene said that everybody feels threatened by their environment, and the best way to overcome it is to have control over it. For me, this seemed so similar to this realist idea in international relations. In fact, this idea that the fundamental motivation of all of us, all humans, all individuals, is to survive and get power in order to ensure our survival is a classical realist perspective. Remember I mentioned before the two prominent types of realism, classical realism and structural realism. Other realists like Mearsheimer might disagree with the quote I gave from Robert Greene. And instead of saying that every body feels threatened by their environment and wants to increase their power, it's in fact every nation that feels threatened by other nations in the international system. So, whereas classical realists would say that it's human nature for individuals to want to survive and in order to survive gain power, structural realists like Mearsheimer would say it's not necessarily the individuals that are like this, but rather it's the international structure which forces nations to act in this way, but in a way which is trying to increase their power other countries, for example, in order to survive. It sounds pretty strange, right? Everything nations do, or even perhaps individuals, is with the drive to survive in mind, that even if I am nice to the bus driver or not, it's at the end of the day something related to survival. Yeah, I thought the same when I first heard about this. Perhaps on a national level it's easier to understand. For example, if the US and China are making some deal about import, exports, trade and so on, maybe it's easy to rationalize that the US, above all, are doing the deal because they want to ensure their survival. For example, perhaps they're not doing the deal because they particularly care about the Chinese government or the Chinese population, but because they think it will increase their power, which, after all, will help them to survive. But what about on an individual level, like being nice to your bus driver? Well, some realists would say choosing to be nice with somebody in the service sector even, for example, although it sounds a bit far-fetched.
Did you hear the bell? Remember, this means that I'm using some advanced vocabulary or maybe introducing a key concept. But don't worry if you're just listening to the podcast. All of this new or key vocabulary will be repeated along with the definitions at the end of the episode.
We're a bit far away from the idea of survival. Perhaps it's one way to ensure that your life is a little bit easier. And if your life's a little bit easier, then your survival is also easier. So for example, maybe somebody decides or subconsciously decides, oh, I'm always going to be nice to my bus drivers. And you might think they're just being nice, but maybe a realist would say the reason they're being nice is because the bus driver is an important person for them. You know, they take them to work every day. And, you know, if you're not nice to them, maybe they will reject you getting on the bus one time if you forget your pass. Or perhaps if you really upset them, maybe they will drive more erratically. Maybe there's more chance you will crash. Maybe that's an extreme example. But the point that if you're nice to the bus driver, then maybe the one time you forget your bus pass, he will let you off and let you on the bus. Whereas if you're not very nice to him or her, then they will reject you when you forget your bus pass. So maybe that would be a realist argument for why on an individual level people are nice to each other. According to structural realists like Mearsheimer, the reason why nations and the international structure forces them to act in this way is because, according to them, the international system is in a state of anarchy. Anarchy, maybe you've heard this word and you think it means like chaos or disorder, but actually in this case, in international relations and politics and so on, anarchy refers to the idea that there is no centralized government. So, for example, Mearsheimer, the international system is in a state of anarchy or anarchic because there is not one government which can control all of the other governments, at least not literally or directly. For example, although there are institutions like the United Nations or the European Union, nations are still sovereign, they're still independent. So, although the UN might recommend you to do something, or the EU for a European country, these countries still have the sovereignty, have the independence to not do these things. Maybe that could result in some negative consequences, maybe some sanctions from the UN, or maybe the EU might threaten to kick you out or something like that. But as a sovereign nation, these institutions do not have the power to just come in your country and put you in jail and run your country for you. There are rules to be a part of these institutions, so if you don't follow the rules, maybe there's consequences. But for realists, the idea is that these institutions are not governments. They can recommend governments do things, try to persuade them, but at the end of the day, nations are sovereign, and therefore, each sovereign nation is in a state of anarchy, that there is no centralized power. And because of this state of anarchy and nobody can control everybody equally, you have to look out for yourself, because the world is a realistic place. So we cannot be sure that another country will act in a certain way. Maybe they say they will help you, but there's no government to make them help you.
As Mearsheimer stated on the Lex Friedman podcast in reference to nations, I can't know your intentions. If you're another state, I can't know that at some point you might come after me. You might. And if you're really powerful and I'm not, I'm in trouble. He also stated in one of his books, in the anarchic world of international politics, it's better to be Godzilla than Bambi. What do you think about these quotes? Please comment.
One example to back up this idea that the international system is anarchic, that there's no centralized power, is the recent situation with the Paris Agreement or the Paris Accord, and when Donald Trump was the president of the US. In this time, Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement. This was quite a famous story because the Paris Agreement was about cutting emissions, and it was an environmental idea, an environmental deal, and Trump decided that the US will not be a part of it. So of course this was in all the news, and it was a big scandal and so on. But in the end, what really happened to the US? What happened to Trump because he withdrew? At the end of the day, especially if you're a powerful country like the US, if you do not follow the orders or the guidance of these international organizations like the UN, then nothing too bad will happen to you. At least this is what we've seen historically, at least with the US. If you're a smaller country, a less powerful country, or maybe a country which is not as in line with, for example, the US, maybe, for example, Cuba or Iran, then maybe the punishment for not going along or not following these rules could have strong effects. But realists would say that nevertheless each country is free to do what it wants. Maybe there's consequences, but at the end of the day they have the sovereign right, they have the autonomy to make their own decisions, and therefore there's no world government and the system is anarchic. In fact, these ideas and this rationality, especially for realism, is not really about what is ideal. Remember, the opposite of realist is idealist. So I'm sure many realists like Mearsheimer wish that the international structure was not anarchic or was not threatening to nations. Perhaps Robert Greene wishes that it wasn't human nature to seek power, right? So for realists, it's not really about something they're glad that this is the way it is, but rather this is the way they see it. This is either human nature or the international structure, and it's something we can't help, even if we wish we could. Maybe you think this is nonsense, and you have a very different opinion of human nature or even perhaps the international system. And remember, that's completely fine. I don't want you to agree with all of these ideas. In fact, it wouldn't make sense that you did, because many of these ideas are opposing each other. For example, Classical Realists and Structural Realists disagree on a lot of things. That's why there are two branches of realism. As well, and even more so, in the next episode we're going to try to tackle liberalism. And as I said before, liberalism, especially to many realists, is the antonym, is the opposite of realism. For me, each of these ideologies has a nugget of truth to it, or perhaps something that can make you understand the world better, even if it's something you disagree with. Before we go today, let me give you something to think about. Talking about classical versus structural realism. So currently, unfortunately, there's a war happening in Ukraine. It's not my job here to tell you anything, what's right, what's wrong. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about that. But let's talk about it from a realist perspective. Let's see what you think about this. So, from a classical realist perspective, this idea that wanting to increase your power is an individual thing, it's human nature, not just something about nations or organizations. From this perspective, maybe somebody would say that Russia invaded Ukraine because an individual like Putin had this drive for power, this drive to survive. Without committing this act, maybe he thought that he would not survive, maybe he would not continue to be the leader, or maybe worse. So from a classical realist perspective, maybe it was because of Putin's individual motivation for power why Russia invaded Ukraine. Okay? Maybe you agree, maybe not, but that's what maybe a classical realist would say. Okay? On the other hand, for a structural realist, they might say that it was the international system which caused this to happen. And a common narrative about this would be that it was maybe something like the NATO expansion which caused a retaliation. The fact that Russia felt threatened by the system. Like we said, according to them, the system is anarchic, there's no centralized government. So Russia, even though it's, a crime, of course, to invade or attack another country, they're independent and they could do it. And they did it, perhaps, for structural realists, they did it because they felt threatened by the international environment as a nation. So what do you think? Is it because of an individual or maybe just a group of individuals and their personal quest for power? Or is it the system, perhaps, which kind of forces the hand of world leaders? Please comment, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Until next time.
Thank you for listening and or watching today's episode. Before presenting today's key vocabulary, please allow me to read you a quote from the great Roman emperor and so-called philosopher king, Marcus Aurelius. If thought is something we share, then so is reason. What makes us reasoning beings? If so, then the reason that tells us what to do and what not to do is also shared. And if so, we share a common law, and thus are fellow citizens, and fellow citizens of something. And in that case, our state must be the world. What other entity could all of humanity belong to? And from it, from this state we share, come thought and reason and law. And now here's today's key vocabulary, page 1. Far-fetched, not likely or difficult to believe, outlandish. Erratically, moving or behaving in a way that is not regular, certain or expected. To let someone off, to not punish someone who has committed a crime or done something wrong, or to not punish them severely. Anarchy, the state of society without a centralized governing body. For example, the absence of a global government. Sovereign, one that exercises supreme permanent authority, especially in a nation. Self-governing, independent. To withdraw, to stop being involved in a situation, being responsible for something, or belonging to an organization or agreement. Page 2. To be in line with, to be in agreement or accordance with someone or something. To go along with, to act in accordance with another's actions, especially when their motive or goal is unknown. To tackle a subject, to try to deal with something or someone in order to reach a solution, to take on. A nugget of truth, some wisdom within or among a greater story, even if some other elements of the idea are questionable. Retaliation, the act of doing something harmful to somebody because they have done something or said something harmful to you. And finally, to force someone's hand, to make someone do something they do not want to, or act sooner than they had intended to. Thanks guys, see you next time.